Hi, Michaela.
Hello, Steve.
Well, we're recording this on the autumn equinox, so I thought it would be very interesting to talk a bit about autumn. So, when I say autumn to you, what comes to your mind?
Sweaters, or as they say where you come from, jumpers. But yes, that too. But I think, any change in season, and particularly, I think, from the summer to the fall, is kind of an interesting moment to look at, practices and also procedures and habits and how we orient in time and space and daylight and in the seasons and in our body, because with the equinox, of course, right, the equinox is kind of such an interesting moment in time, because everywhere on earth day and light are the same length, right, and that only happens twice a year. So with that said, it's an interesting moment in time because of the way the light goes, the way the light shines, and you can tell that different quality of the light. And of course, it also means in the northern hemisphere that the days are getting shorter and shorter and shorter till the solstice, and the body kind of wants to go into that period. But of course, for most of us, and I heard this over the weekend when we were teaching, this is the busiest season. So while the body should somewhat slow down and transition into winter, if it's the fall equinox, the schedule for most people after the summer actually gets more hectic than it should for the natural rhythms of the body. So when you ask me fall or autumn, I think about transitions and different clothing and leaves falling and harvest time and the abundance of that. And yeah.
Well, I know you're very keen on archetypes and symbolism and so on. And so, one of the symbols when I think of autumn that comes to mind is the harvest. So, I'm wondering, when you turn your sort of archetype symbol brain on, or turn that mindset on to the harvest, what sort of ideas come to you?
Well, when I turn that part of the brain on, right, there's a whole symbolism of having essentially grown and watered and fertilized and everything, ideas and fruit and whatever over the summer. And then at this particular moment in time, there's kind of a good moment to look at what is actually what came to fruition, right? What is actually happened over the summer period that can be harvested, but also what didn't happen and what would be done differently. And I've spent the last week, it's finally cooled down some here in California. I've spent the last week clearing out my vegetable beds and ripping out the summer fruit and the summer vegetables that are done and that have been harvested. And so in any gardener's mind, you kind of look at what grew, what didn't grow, what did really well, what didn't do well. Funny enough, for both me and some friends here who also garden in this area, we didn't get tomatoes this year, right, or barely any tomatoes. So you kind of look at what actually did really well, in my case, squashes, and then what didn't do well, tomatoes. And then that, that has a whole series of preparations then for the next planting. So for instance, the bed where the tomatoes were needs to be freshly amended and dug through and things added so that in the next growth cycle, the soil is better. And I also need to look at, was there pests or things like that? And the same, of course, applies to our our fruits and vegetables of the mind, meaning our plans and our practices and the things that we do, both business and personal. What worked, what didn't work, what are we harvesting, what's coming to an end, and then what starts from here or what needs to be amended and or put to bed till, the next growth season.
Yeah, very interesting. There's something else that often comes to my mind with this season in terms of notable events is Halloween. Halloween, or Samhain, as they call it. Some people call it that. I think we'll do a special episode on Halloween or Samhain when it's coming around. And perhaps in that episode, do some sort of rituals or practices, or offer some guided follow along kind of explorations. I think that would be quite interesting indeed as a special Samhain Halloween edition. But in advance of that, do you orient much towards Samhain? Do you have much of a sense of that festival, and the veils are thin, etc.? And do you go for that?
I do, actually. It's probably one of my more favorite, moments of in ritual engagement of the year for a couple of reasons. Number one, in the more traditional Halloween sense, right? There is, of course, pumpkins and things of that nature, and I love pumpkins and all things orange. I don't know why, but I do. And so, to me, that whole season, I grow my own pumpkins. I buy pumpkins. There's a whole aesthetic there that I love. But long before I came to the States where Halloween is a thing, in the part of Austria where I grew up, that particular time of the year is considered very special. And as a matter of fact, on Saturday in the 12 Facets of the Feminine, we were actually working with, it's the season of the very potent feminine archetypes. And we were actually working with a protector archetype, a wrathful protector archetype. And I was telling, within that lecture that traditionally that was a season, and that particular, day was considered where the veil was the thinnest. And hence you could really communicate with the ancestors and your lineage and things like that. But also it was dangerous because you could go beyond the veil, so to speak, to meet your ancestors or communicate, but not so benevolent forces could come the other way as well. And so the tradition of dressing up in something incredibly scary, right? And wearing, in the olden days, it was like you'd have like a head of some animal on and paint your face and claws and fangs and all those kind of things were considered necessary to ward off anything coming through the veils to hurt us. I think that's, for me, that has always held like a real fascination, that being able to traverse the veils, honing one's sensitivity towards the fluctuations in perception, but also that aspect of the scaring off things or dressing up in a way that sends the warning of the protector is it's an interesting thing. And then, of course, in the way I was taught within the teachings of my lineage, that particular whole thread around the thinning of the veils and the wrathful protectress, ties into practices on the charnel grounds, which then, ties back into Halloween, where there's the cemetery and all of that. So it's kind of nice to see how these things weave together as a means of also engaging with what scares us or what we're fearful of, and death, and all things decay and death, and boneyards and graveyards is typically an area where we don't put a lot of attention, but of course something that will happen to all of us. And so that entire period, which is kind of also, when we talk about autumn to winter, right, it's the dying off, it's the decaying, it's the whittling away or things of that nature, that then leads to death in the winter, and then of course the resurgence afterwards. So I've always been really fascinated with that entire line of inquiry.
Do you change your behavior in this season at all to reflect these themes?
Yeah, I do, for a number of reasons. As I was saying earlier, uh, unfortunately, when the body really wants to kind of prepare for hibernation, right, and when there is a kind of slowing down in a certain way, typically that's also when it gets really busy, for me and everyone around me, it seems. So I'm trying to, as I always do, stay with the biorhythms, right? Stay with the rhythms of my body and stay within the practice of keeping my circadian rhythms stable and in a way that it really supports the body. Because in the context of embodiment practices, what can we do for optimal functioning? Of course, as the days go shorter, things have to change because you don't get as much sunlight. Then, of course, there's the whole thing with daylight savings, which is not yet upon us, the shift in that time. But so it takes a little bit more attention and planning on getting that first sunlight in the morning, because it's later. And my schedule, of course, is such that I get up at a certain time. And in the summer, I can get up at a certain time and it's already pretty light. And so I start my day with like a tea ritual, and I do some practices in the morning with the bright sun, because my bedroom faces the sunrise. And so then I'm set up for the day, and then, I can do whatever I need to do. So in the fall, leading up to the winter, I have to kind of slightly redo my schedule so that I can still get the sun exposure, which happens later. So that happens around this time where it's really noticeable, where I just, schedule myself differently. I've also noticed that the moment it got cooler here, my food, the things I wanted to eat changed really quickly, very dramatically. I suddenly wanted root vegetables and butternut squashes and, like roasted things and much more grounding food suddenly. And that just happened just as the season shifted and the temperature cooled. And so I try and kind of go with that and give my body a bit more of the seasonal foods that are, natural for the season, as well, so that even though my work schedule might not slow down, at least my body's rhythms can go with what comes with the season.
Maybe we could say something about that early morning light exposure and why that's an important part of your routine. You really prioritize that.
Yeah, I've been really prioritizing that because, of course, we're still doing Zoom teaching, and that for me, in the States, happens early in the morning. And so I've noticed that particular, requirement of needing the ring light on me way, way earlier than I would usually get up had a really negative effect on my health and general well-being. So I researched this in fine detail and have a whole protocol down now on how to keep my body in the proper rhythm. And it really actually meant having to change the way I kind of do my life, in the sense that while we're still doing, the online teaching, I have to go to bed way earlier. And I'm also making sure that I don't get a lot of light, blue light or any light in the evening. But then I make sure that first thing in the morning, I get bright sunlight and enough of it so that it starts my entire, circadian rhythm towards the sleep time. And that's been something that's been really, really good. And I feel such a big difference in well-being with that, with that routine. But it does require a bit of planning and really making sure that I don't, miss that first 2 hours of the day with some sunlight. I've also stopped drinking tea first thing in the morning. I drink two, huge things of water for the first hour or so, and then drink tea, also in an attempt to kind of really smooth out those rhythms and get the cortisol to happen at the proper moments and not at the moments it shouldn't happen. So there's a lot of really great research out, and it was really important to dial that in. And I'm sleeping way, way, way better and longer, and feel so much more energized throughout the day.
Yeah, we've I think said before in this podcast that that's become a very important part of your routine, especially given that you're essentially working shifts sometimes when you're teaching in these international time zones. You're getting up at odd times. But actually, in general, even when you're not doing that over the summer, we haven't been doing that quite as much. You've still kept to that and found it to be very beneficial. Something else that I think affects people a bit, or can affect people a bit around this time of year, certainly going towards the winter, is the effect of the season on the mood. And some people have linked that or suggested that that has something to do with the shorter days, etc. Increasing depression of various kinds. What do you think of that? And do you have any advice or anything you particularly do to sort of buttress your mood as you come into this season heading towards the winter?
Well, I mean, now there's all these studies out on, and where essentially daylight or light exposure is directly linked to mood. And I think we've known that for a while, because I remember I lived in Hamburg once, and there was just never any sun, and it was I don't tend towards depression, but I was, I could barely get out of bed in the morning. It was just so oppressive after like 6 months of not having seen the sun. And even back then, they had these little light things that you could buy where you're supposed to sit in front of that bright light, to combat what they back then called, I think, seasonal affective disorder. I think it's still called that. SAD, SAD. So in that research now that I read, and there's this great podcast out there, which I guess we can link to. There's a strong suggestion that the more sunlight you get early on in the day, the better the mood and the regulation is. But of course, not everybody has sunlight. Where you live now, it's going to get somewhat gloomy, right? And also quite dark, because you're a lot further north than I'm at, for instance. So in absence of the sunlight, you're supposed to get something like a ring light, right? I'm looking at my ring light. Like a ring light, and have that on. And the key is to have it a bit up. So not directly in front, but a bit up. And that bit up simulates that morning sunlight. And you're supposed to have a certain amount of lux, which you can easily produce with a ring light, from what I gather. But there's also these little pads you can buy, that you can put somewhere, so that you get that light in the first 2 hours upon rising. And then, of course, when we talk about stuff that's not artificial, and stuff that's, good in the context of what, embodiment and ritual and self-care and practice, I think that being outside more when it gets darker is really, really important and really useful. And of course, you don't want to go out when it's colder or wetter or, a bit gloomy, but it's exactly then that you should really be out. And ideally also, get enough light on your skin. You produce enough vitamin D, which also is connected to mood and, all of those kind of things. So while I'm not an expert, or a health expert, those are the things that I do, and that I feel make a huge difference for me and the people I've turned onto it over the, couple of years that I've been playing around with that. There's just something really good about, aside from the science of the sun exposure, there's something really nice about starting the day with a bit of nature and a little bit of sunlight and a little bit of fresh air on your skin and on your body. And, I think the mood effects, the positive mood effects just from being in nature alone is worth exploring a bit more outside activity than usual.
When I grew up in the Shetland Islands, which are quite far north, it would be in the winter dark when I went to school, whatever that time was, 7:30, 8 something. And then dark when I would come home again. When I'd leave the school, I'd walk in the dark and walk out in the dark, 3:30 or whenever it was that we'd finish school. So a lot of people on that island would use light boxes, these little light boxes which are supposed to have this same sort of lux that you're talking about. It seems important if you're using the outside light that you've mentioned before, at least in your own routine, that you don't. It's not through a window. It's not enough. You can't just sort of look out the window. It's you emphasized in the past, I think, to me, direct is the way to go, right?
Yeah, supposedly most of those windows nowadays have all kinds of filters, UV filters and stuff, so you get incomplete bandwidth of light, which doesn't help because it all has to do with certain receptors in the retina. Those receptors jumpstart actually the production of melatonin. So even though you are doing the morning waking up thing, you are also setting your clock so that melatonin gets emitted at the right time at night so you can sleep well. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. You're supposed to get it directly and not through a window, because it takes too long. You can like do 5 or 10 minutes if you're somewhere in California, or you have to do 20 minutes if it's cloudy or things like that. But that's still totally doable. And of course, when you have one of those ring lights, which is the second best thing, or the light box, you have to do longer. I know some people who have a light box kind of on their desk for most of the day. But then you're supposed to wind it down in the evening. So you're not supposed to get, light in the evening, a lot of light in the evening. And I think that's been really quite interesting too, where I'm just having way, way, way less lights on in the house. And I really make a point of not looking at my phone or my computer after a certain amount of time, up and about. I just stop for the last hour before I go to bed and don't look at a screen or read a Kindle, but I read an actual book. That's been really nice. And I've gone so far because, of course, we had some pretty extreme schedule. Like you said, it was like shift work. I have a red light in my nightstand lamp so that I don't get, that bright light, even if I have to get up in the middle of the night, which is fun because it also looks really nice.
Very cool indeed. Well, you mentioned 12 Facets earlier, and I know that season 4, the final quarter of 12 Facets, is about to close for registrations now, as we're coming into the last quarter of the year. Maybe you could say a little something about the 12 Facets program. I know it's proved enormously popular, and what it is we're doing in that program, and in particular what we're going to be looking at in the 4th quarter. And can people join now, and even at this late stage?
Yeah, people can join. The whole idea in this last quarter, we have 3 meetings. So it's once a month for 5 hours. And in that session, and as always, it's in 2 streams. So people from all over the world can join in their proper time zones. And in each of those days, we'll explore one archetype, and we'll explore both the meaning of the archetype, how it applies to us. Then we do embodiment practices. Then there's guided explorations. There's also connection with the other participants. We do these talk processes. There's a Q&A where people can ask their specific questions, and I work with them directly. And it's great fun. And this particular season is called The Beautiful Tragedies.
And what are the archetypes you're going to be doing this season?
Yeah, so in this particular season, we are looking at the eternal child, the handless maiden, and the bone woman. So those are the three archetypes we're working with. And in general, with these archetypes, we're looking at how they apply to each person individually. So it's a very, very tailored and personalized approach to the archetypes so that each participant can really find themselves in that story or that archetype and use it in their lives.
Great. It's proven to be a very rich and I think compelling exploration for those that have been attending that. It's been really a very interesting program, and there's still time to get involved in season 4 if you want to join. There is still time to sign up to that. So the way to do that, of course, is to go to www.michaelaboehm.com, and of course there'll be a link below in the description too, and look for the 12 Facets season 4. That's how to sign up. So is there anything else as we bring this to a close, Michaela, that you want to say about autumn or any related themes?
Well, I mean, there's so much more that we could talk about, but I think the important piece is to keep in mind that the needs of the body and the rhythms are changing. And in order to kind of keep that connection with the body and keep that connection with the rhythms of the body, it's nice to look at what practices can be added or taken away, and how would you shift things so that your body is well as the season changes.
Michaela, thank you very much.
Thank you.